Wondery.
I'm Lindsay Graham, and this is American Scandal. Today, we wrap up our series on corruption in the state capital of Albany, New York. We started the series with the rise and fall of former New York Attorney General and Governor Eliot Spitzer. His very public demise made national headlines and was also the subject several years later of the documentary Client 9, The Rise and Fall of Eliot Spitzer. In 2018, I spoke about that film with its Oscar-winning director, Alex Gibney. In the course of making the film, Gibney interviewed Eliot Spitzer himself and many of his enemies, providing a much richer understanding of the scandal and of the corrosive effects of power, especially in Albany. In addition to Gibney's multiple Emmys, a Grammy, several Peabody Awards, and more, he has also won an Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature in 2007 for the film Taxi to the Dark Side, which he wrote and directed. He's the president and founder of Jigsaw Productions and has been named by the New York Times and Esquire magazine as the most important and prolific documentarian of our time. Alex Gibney joins us from Jigsaw's studio in New York City. American Scandal is sponsored by the new Audible original Bad Republican by Meghan McCain. In her debut audio memoir, Meghan McCain gives a first-hand look into the life of the conservative rebel and departing co-host of The View. You'll hear what it's like to grow up as the daughter of an American icon and to mourn his loss very publicly just 1 year into her tenure as co-host of America's most-watched daytime talk show. Her memoir also reveals how she handled attacks from the U.S. president and her thoughts on cancel culture, dating, and how our country treats new mothers. It's unsparingly honest, deeply relatable, and highly entertaining. Go beyond what you know about Meghan McCain from TV and your newsfeed. Visit audible.com/Bad Republican and listen now.
We get support from the new podcast, Hemingway's Picasso. Stephen Coe lived many lives. He was an NFL journeyman, a male model, and one of the most well-connected smugglers in 1980s Miami. Coe collected many souvenirs from his adventures, but his most treasured bounty, a beautiful ceramic crafted by Pablo Picasso and gifted to Ernest Hemingway at the author's Cuban home. So the story goes. Lost during the Cuban Revolution, the artwork resurfaced when Coe took it as payment for a drug run financed by the notorious Pablo Escobar. Coe passed away in 2018, passing the piece down to his son, Stevie. Stevie feels he needs to complete his father's mission of selling this piece and telling Steve's cinematic life story. Is the Picasso authentic or a fraud? Was Steve Coe a big talker or a real deal smuggler? Listen to new episodes of Hemingway's Picasso every Monday wherever you get your podcasts.
Alex Gibney, thank you for joining me on this interview episode of American Scandal.
Thank you, Lindsay. Good to be here.
Your work really spans the gamut, from documentaries on Scientology to musicians like Frank Sinatra and James Brown, and you've even executive produced a cooking series on Netflix. So given such breadth, what draws you to a project? What about a subject gets you thinking, this needs to be a film?
Well, very often I'm drawn to stories that look behind the headlines. You know, once the caravan of the 24/7 news cycle has passed by, a lot of evidence and a lot of detail, and sometimes the very essential meaning of a story is left behind. People have decided what the story is about, and they've moved on with a 24/7 caravan. So I'm intrigued at what the real story is and what people missed. And so in the case of the Eliot Spitzer tale, I found a number of interesting things about it. I was offered this story by a group of people who thought I should take it on. And I was initially not so interested because it just seemed like a garden variety sex scandal. But the more I thought about it, the more interesting it became. I mean, this was the sheriff of Wall Street who goes down just a few months before the world economy explodes. That timing seemed interesting to me. And then the whole idea of, there was a kind of Murder on the Orient Express quality to this, which is to say that Spitzer was going after some of the titans of industry and banking. And as a group, they end up taking him down. So it seemed to me a pretty interesting story about power and how power really works, and how we like to think that people in government are more powerful than private industry. Maybe it's not so, and maybe it's more of a bare-knuckle brawl than we think. And then there was the whole issue of how he went down, that is to say, the sex scandal. And I was interested in the sexual politics as well as the electoral politics. So for all those reasons, it seemed a very interesting story to explore.
In 2007, Eliot Spitzer is elected governor. He spent 8 years as New York's attorney general and earned the moniker the Sheriff of Wall Street, fighting corruption in the financial industry. He was a hero for a lot of people and seemed too big
to jail.
Right. Were you living in New York at the time? Were you an admirer?
I was in the New York area. I mean, I live in the great and corrupt state of New Jersey, but I work in New York. So of course I was intensely interested in what was going on in New York. And I certainly was an admirer of Spitzer. I thought he was fulfilling an important function. Now, he may have been legislating from the Attorney General's office, but frankly, I thought he was doing something that needed to be done, which was to hold the power of Wall Street in check, because they were rapaciously violating the rules that we regard, you know, in a kind of idealistic way as essential to the functioning of good markets and fairness in the economy. And he was going up and punching a lot of these people in the nose and basically saying, you can't just be corrupt. I'm going to come down on you, and I'm going to come down on you hard, because as the Attorney General of New York State, I have purview over the financial industry. And so he was one of the few people willing to take those people on, which I found really interesting. And I think, frankly, he could have been president. He was one of the few politicians, Democratic politicians, who polled higher among men than women. So because he was a law and order guy, guys liked him, and women liked him too, because he was trying to stick up for the underdog. So I think he had an opportunity, had he not fallen so far, to become president of the United States. I think he was on his way.
But then, of course, just a year after becoming governor, he's connected to a prostitution ring, which really no one was expecting, given his law and order background. When you were researching this and thinking about the sexual scandal aspect, what was interesting about that portion of the story from a filmmaker's perspective? Was there one single question you needed to answer?
I wouldn't say there was one question, but there were a number of questions. The first thing was, why escorts? Why not have an affair? Or and then I also wanted to know a lot more about the world of escorts, because of course the world of escorts, and when we say escorts, I mean very high-end, high-priced prostitutes or sex workers. So they cater to the financial industry, and of course, as it turns out, they also cater to the attorney general and governor. But so I was interested in why would a crusading and law-abiding attorney general, why would he turn to an escort service, which is of course illegal in New York State? And then I also wanted to know more about it. Like, who was this Ashley Dupre? And it turned out that actually she was not at the heart of the story. She was a rather peripheral character, but I did find somebody who was at the heart of the story. So there were a lot of interesting threads to pull on in order to be able to understand the sexual part of the Spitzer scandal. And
who was it that you found that you thought was at the heart of the story?
We found a woman who's not named. She's called Angelina in the film. But this was a woman who had a great many assignations with Spitzer, and indeed would travel to meet him when he was on the road, which was one of the reasons that she was in the sights of the Department of Justice, because the Department of Justice, weirdly, was trying to make a Mann Act case against Spitzer. And the Mann Act is a much reviled piece of a legislation which makes it illegal to travel with a woman across state lines for immoral purposes. It's what ultimately nailed Jack Johnson way back in the day. And because he traveled across state lines for immoral purposes with this escort, who he requested a number of times, and ultimately ended up having a relationship with, as opposed to a kind of wham-bam sexual encounter, which is how he started his experience at the Emperor's Club VIP. So that brought me into finding this woman, and it took me a long time to get there. When I finally found her, she agreed to talk, but not on camera. And indeed, because her voice is distinctive, didn't want to talk on audio. So what we had to do was I recorded extensive conversations with her. I edited them. And then I actually hired an actress named Ren Schmidt to portray her. And at least initially, that's not disclosed, though ultimately it is disclosed in the film.
In the small town of Fox Lake, Illinois, Joe Glinowitz was a hometown hero and 30-year veteran of the local police department. On September 1st, 2015, just 1 month from retirement, he was found dead outside an abandoned cement plant, shot in the chest twice at close range. While the town and Joe's family mourned his passing, hundreds of police officers launched a manhunt to find his killer. After weeks of searching, the lead investigator discovered chilling secrets about Joe, the local police department, and the village of Fox Lake. These were secrets that, once uncovered, would put the town in the national spotlight and haunt them for years to come. Wondery's shocking true crime podcast, Over My Dead Body, is back for a 3rd season with a story about corruption, betrayal, and the secrets of a fallen hero. Follow Over My Dead Body Season 3, Fox Lake, on Apple Podcasts, or you can listen early and ad-free by subscribing to Wondery Plus in Apple Podcasts or the Wondery app.
The new true crime podcast, Shadow of Truth, explores a haunting murder that left investigators searching for a killer and on a mission for the truth. Police found Tahir Rada's dead body hidden behind a locked bathroom door. As the prosecution and police began to pull together evidence, one person of interest became their focus, Roman Zadarov. And within days, he confessed to Tahir's murder. Everyone considered the case closed, especially after Zadarov was locked up. However, recently revealed new evidence suggests there was a lot more to this story. With new DNA results and shocking witness testimony, Shadow of Truth unravels this mystery. To hear the whole story, listen to the podcast Shadow of Truth. Follow Shadow of Truth on Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, or you can binge all 6 episodes ad-free and early by subscribing to Wondery Plus in Apple Podcasts or the Wondery app.
Another person you interviewed in this documentary is Eliot Spitzer himself, and we would like to play a clip here. He seemed pretty candid throughout his conversations with you, of course, uncomfortable at times, though. Here he is talking about the perception of the scandal.
It is, to a certain extent, a very classic tale, perhaps of an individual who, from the exterior, appears to have been captured by hubris, a sense of standing for virtues and I think working very hard to articulate and work towards establishing rules and boundaries, but then himself slipping and failing. And goes back to the days of Greek mythology. It's not a new story.
He's pretty much just summed up what many people thought, the headline version of his fall. Why do you think he agreed to be interviewed? And when in the interview process did he come to this summary?
That was early. And that part is very much the controlled Eliot Spitzer. And I had a number of interviews with him. And I think over time, we got a little bit deeper than that. That's Eliot Spitzer talking about himself in the third person and also comparing himself to Greek gods. That's the Eliot Spitzer that's very much the public Eliot Spitzer. I think he ultimately wanted to do, but we ultimately got a lot deeper than that, I think. I think he wanted to do this in part, and it took a long time to persuade him to agree to speak. And we were the first people to get him to talk about this publicly. I think he agreed to do it because he didn't want the scandal to be the last chapter. He wanted an opportunity to be able to not just give his side of the story, but to also tell the whole story. So that it was not just a fall from grace. It was a rise and fall story. He wanted people to remember the rise as well as the fall. And so on that basis, and I was interested in that part too. So on that basis, we agreed to talk. And talk we did. And I think it was a series of 5 interviews. At the very last one, when we finally finished, he turned to me and quipped, "So, same time next week?"
Do you think his desire to tell the full story, the rise and fall, I mean, it's understandable that everyone will remember the fall, and it's understandable that he would want people to know about the rise. Does he make his case? Was he compelling that his whole arc should be remembered?
Yes, I think he was compelling. I think if you look at his career as Attorney General, it was a terribly impressive career in terms of being the sheriff of Wall Street and being kind of the de facto regulator, in a system where the SEC and Congress was unwilling to hold Wall Street to account because Wall Street has so much money. If you're a politician, you need Wall Street's money to get elected. Spitzer was very rich. He didn't need their money. And frankly, the way our economic system is structured, it's almost intentional in terms of the weakening of regulatory bodies that attempt to, hold the financial industry in check. So there was nobody minding the store until Spitzer. So I found what he did in that realm to be very impressive. And indeed, as an attorney general, he did what attorneys general are supposed to do, which was to protect the weak against the strong. To look at people who were running scams against people who couldn't afford to fight back, and he would fight back for them. So I found it very powerful.
In these interview segments with Eliot Spitzer, he looks like he's sitting on a living room couch. It feels familiar and close. Where was that filmed, and what was your intention in that setting?
I think the intent, we wanted to find a place, and I think that's part of the reason why you said same time next week. We wanted to find a place that was secure. I knew I was going to interview him over a number of different times, and I wanted control of that space. So it was the apartment, it was the parents' apartment of one of my producers. And we treated it, and because the parents were mostly overseas, we had access to it over a period of time, and we were able to make it into a kind of a set. But we wanted to feel very comfortable, and therefore the couch and the decor. It's at once both comfortable and a little bit severe. In shooting the Spitzer interview, and frankly in shooting the Angelina interview with the actress, those are the only 2 people with whom I used a device called the Tonytron. It's a device, a series of mirrors you put over the housing of the lens, which allows you to be looking at the speaker, in this case Spitzer, but because he's looking into a mirror over the lens, he appears to be looking directly into the barrel of the lens, which in fact he is doing. And so that gives it a kind of intimacy that's unlike all the other interviews. So it's as though those are the only 2 people that have that kind of direct eye contact with the viewer.
The title of the documentary is Client 9. Just briefly, where does that name come from, and why did you decide on that?
It seemed a little bit like Citizen Kane, but in a very different way. Client 9 is taken from a document compiled by the Department of Justice when they were investigating Spitzer, or they were theoretically investigating the Emperor's Club VIP. And in so doing, they discovered a number of clients, certainly clients 1 through 8, and there were many after 9. Interestingly, the only name that leaked to the press was Client 9, Eliot Spitzer. But there seemed to be something sort of universal about it. He was just Client 9, anonymous, yet at the same time, of course, he was Eliot Spitzer. So there was a certain poetry to it, a certain cruel poetry, I should say. And frankly, it was also salacious and intentionally so, because this was a story about a scandal. But interestingly, Client 9, even that phrase has a number of different meanings. I mean, there's a salacious quality to it because he's a client of an escort service, but there's a law enforcement quality to it too. And that document is something that the Department of Justice used to leak to various news organizations, particularly the New York Times, as a way of giving them a series of breadcrumbs that they could follow in order to be able to find out that the governor was using an escort service. They did that instead of indicting him. which was probably more effective than in destroying his political career than indicting him. And frankly, I'm not sure they had grounds to indict him on a federal level.
Well, this leads into something I was going to ask you. You mentioned earlier the feds were theoretically investigating the Emperor's Club, and you just seem to indicate that this theoretical investigation was just a means to get to Spitzer. Do you think that's really the case?
Yes. I don't think there's any question about it. It wasn't as if the federal government as a rule, does not take on the busting of prostitution rings. City attorneys take that on, sometimes state attorneys take that on, but not the federal government, generally speaking. So they were following a trail. And then once they found that the trail led to the Emperor's Club, they began to investigate the Emperor's Club. But it was really following Spitzer. It was not an investigation into a prostitution ring that just happened to stumble on Eliot Spitzer. Now, this I should say, takes place at a time when there was a great deal of controversy over whether or not the U.S. Department of Justice was being rapidly politicized by the Bush administration. And indeed, the U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York was a man named Michael Garcia, who ultimately, I think as a reward for taking out Eliot Spitzer, was rewarded with a partner's position at, I believe, Kirkland & Ellis. You guys would have to check that. But that's a very prominent, if I'm right, and you should check it. If I'm right, that's a very prominent, very prototypically pro-Republican firm from which a lot of the Republican power brokers, in legal terms, often emerge.
Well, this gets to the question of Spitzer's enemies. Certainly, he made enemies of a lot of very powerful and very wealthy people on Wall Street. You would think or hope that the federal government itself has no direct animus towards him, but perhaps the people in installed positions might. You made some discoveries about these enemies of Spitzer, but then left it a mystery on who might have been involved in the downfall. Do you have a thesis on what happened and who was behind it?
Yeah, so I should say two things about this. One is I do have a thesis. But I only went as far in the film as I felt the facts would take me. So I go right on up to the edge of the thesis, but I can't say definitively that I know exactly what happened because the key perpetrators in this murder on the Orient Express story didn't confess. But since the film, a number of people have told me that I was right, at least in terms of some of the key figures who were in business that went after Spitzer, notably Ken Langone, Maurice Hank Greenberg, who was the head of AIG, and Dick Grasso, who ran the New York Stock Exchange. I had a number of sources tell me that they toasted Spitzer's demise with a magnum of champagne at the 21 Club. And Langone denies ever hiring private eyes to look after Spitzer. But we know that private eyes were the reason that Spitzer was ultimately, that people got enough clues to understand that something might have been wrong. And then, through banking records, a parallel investigation takes place. And the Department of Justice becomes involved. And I do think that there was an animus towards Spitzer because he was arrogant. And I think the Department of Justice felt that sometimes he was muscling into their territory, and also that he wasn't observing the proper role of an attorney general. He was trying to legislate from the attorney general's office. So I think there was a certain amount of ill will towards Spitzer from the Department of Justice. In addition, I do think there were elements in an extremely politicized Department of Justice who were gunning for Spitzer. So all these people got together. That's why I think Murder on the Orient Express is such a good analogy. All these people got together to plunge the knife into Spitzer. But the thing that really takes him, so I think it starts with a private investigation into Spitzer, just to see what dirt can emerge. Once a little bit of dirt is revealed, the Department of Justice takes over, and then they produce a thorough investigation, which they then leak to the press. And that, in short terms, is how Spitzer went down.
One of Spitzer's largest and most public enemy was not a titan of industry, but in Albany, Joe Bruno. He was the Senate Majority Leader of New York for more than a decade, and certainly during Spitzer's time as governor. They had a bitter rivalry, especially after what became known as Troopergate. Here's a clip from the documentary in which you talk to Bruno about their relationship.
What was strange with Eliot Spitzer was he could be pleasant and charming and act very caring. When my wife was reported as being seriously ill, he called me several times. And this is right in the height of some of our worst exchanges. Couldn't have been any more pleasant. But when he came after me in what was called Troopergate, then it was apparent that this man really intended to destroy me.
So my first question is, it's obvious that the two of them are from different backgrounds and different political parties. But why do you suppose he and Spitzer had such a hard time getting along?
Well, I do think there are a number of reasons for that. One of them is I think Spitzer was, in some ways, a great public figure, but a terrible politician. Some of his own advisors would tell me with great anguish that they could never get Eliot Spitzer to play the political game in which you try to seed with somebody you need as an ally, an idea, even though it's your idea, and let them take credit for it. And once they've absorbed it as their idea, it becomes a lot easier to make it happen. They think it's theirs, and so they want to take credit for it. And Spitzer would always say things like, well, why should I let him take credit for it? It was my idea. And everybody would sort of slap their foreheads like, you idiot. That's not how the game is played. The game is played by making other people feel good. That was the game that Clinton was so masterful at. And his own way, Joe Bruno, gentleman Joe Bruno, he was great. He's a very charming man. I wouldn't say Eliot, there are things I find charismatic or charming about Eliot, but generally speaking, he's not a charming guy. Bill Clinton walks into a room, he seduces everybody. Not so Eliot Spitzer. Eliot Spitzer uses force, and he learned that in the Attorney General's office. That's not always such a great way of getting legislation through, particularly in a kind of hidebound environment like the Senate and Assembly in New York State, which is deeply corrupt. So he wasn't good at glad handing, and instead he would punch people in the nose, and he'd be surprised that people would remember that he had punched them in the nose when it came time to cut him some slack. We think about a number of people who went through big sex scandals and survived, including a man named David Vitter, from a senator from Louisiana, who ordered prostitutes during roll call votes in Congress. And yet all he had to do was to pray to God that, and note to everybody that he was a sinner, but God had forgiven him. And then he goes on with his political career. It was completely analogous to Spitzer. Clinton would be another one, or John Edwards. Well, John Edwards fell, but Clinton, survived his political scandal. Why? Because Clinton had friends. Spitzer, at the time of his scandal, had no friends. So I don't think he was a very good political player at all. He didn't know how to make friends. He knew how to make enemies.
It's 2018, and it doesn't look like much has really changed in Albany since Spitzer resigned. Many of these characters that were instrumental in his fall have fallen themselves. Bruno forced to resign. And just recently, earlier this month, former New York State Assembly Speaker Sheldon Silver, one of the three men in the room with Spitzer, was granted his request for bail and to stay out of prison until his appeal of his conviction of corruption charges. And then you have former New York State Senate Majority Leader Dean Skelos and his son Adam, who had also had their sentencing trial. A lot in the news about the current governor, Cuomo, as well. What is it about Albany that persists, that even despite Spitzer's steamrolling charge to change it, Cuomo's attempt to do the same? Why is Albany corrupt, and why is it intractable?
That's probably a really good question for William Kennedy in terms of the culture of Albany. But I suspect that the culture of Albany is as corrupt as it is because it's a representative body of a very wealthy state, and yet these people don't really get paid enough to survive. So they're sort of businessmen representatives who have access to enormous treasures if they play the game well, and so you see incredible corruption, and it will be surprising if that corruption can be rooted out. You noted properly that a number of the key players in the Spitzer scandal or the Spitzer story have become a disgrace themselves and fallen. One exception to that is Andrew Cuomo. Andrew Cuomo was actually pivotal in terms of bringing Spitzer down, if you go back and think about it. He was the one who was really riding very hard on the investigation into Troopergate, which, at least in my view, was kind of a trumped-up episode ginned up by Joe Bruno, just to make Spitzer look bad. But I think Cuomo saw his own rivalry with Spitzer as an opportunity to make that more than it was. That's my own personal view. That's not something that's deeply embedded in the film. But I would also say this, and it's very interesting to note that one of the key financial and political supporters of Cuomo, particularly when he first runs for governor, is Ken Langone, who is Spitzer's archenemy, the man who said, if he's going to try to put a stake in my heart, he better make it steel because wood will break. So the alliance between Ken Langone and Andrew Cuomo is one that people should probably pay a little bit more attention to.
You've had opportunity to interview and converse with a lot of people of power. Albany is a place of power. What do you think it is about power that makes people think that they can get away with things? It's an aphorism. It's easy to say that power corrupts, but what's the mechanism of power that gets into the bloodstream of these people?
I think two things happen simultaneously, and it's a toxic mix. One is when you get a lot of power, you begin to believe your own bullshit. You begin to believe that you are as great and as wonderful as other people say that you are, and they say that you are because you have a lot of power. Surrounded by flatterers, and the next thing you know, you want to believe them. I also think that people with power tend to be on a mission. And when you're on a mission, you believe more strongly in the purity of the end than the goodness of the means to achieve that end. And you somehow believe that the pure end can justify an ignoble or corrupt means. And so this combination of, sense of enormous belief in your own strength of character as a result of those who flatter you, and this sense that the end justifies a ruthless means allows you to be corrupt. I think that, whether it's Eliot Spitzer, who imagined that, look, he was doing so much good for the people of New York and ultimately the people around the country, surely he deserved a little bit of fun. And I think that, and that he could do, as a former crusading attorney general, could engage in activities for which he prosecuted other people. That's a kind of suspension of a belief that is hard to really understand. It's a sort of extreme cognitive dissonance. But I think people in power are afflicted with a blindness and a sense of invulnerability that ultimately, interestingly and ironically, often causes them to lose that power.
This affliction, this sense of invulnerability, most often infects those in positions of public power, politicians, celebrities, certain flashy CEOs. But there's another sort of power, a power you've alluded to, the power of influence behind the scenes and the power of influence of the public narrative.
In terms of power, or in terms of this story, there's an intriguing character that plays a kind of minor role in this film, but who has since played a more fundamental role in the rise of Donald Trump, and that is Roger Stone. It's unclear who hired Roger Stone to tag or target Eliot Spitzer. I suspect it was either Ken Langone or Hank Greenberg or one of their cutouts. But what's interesting about Roger Stone is not only how often and how easily he lies, much like his friend Donald Trump, but also how effective those lies are because they contain an entertainment value that proves so seductive that they then get circulated and recirculated over and over and over again. And it's not worth perseverating too much about this in terms of the specifics of the Client 9 story, but as a metaphor, I think it's terribly important. The whole idea of Eliot Spitzer and his black socks, that is to say, the idea that he wore those black socks to bed when he had these assignations with escorts, is something that was wholly made up by Roger Stone. I know because I talked to the escorts. But it's such a delicious story that even reputable outlets like the New York Times would reprint it. And it's a story of incredible political power because it demeans Spitzer. It makes a mockery. It makes a laughingstock out of him. Now fast forward to the Trump campaign, when Trump can, insinuate and or actually, make up the most outrageous untruths. And yet, because of their entertainment value, they get redistributed and recycled over and over and over again until they have enormous political force. That to me is something that's scary, but also worth looking at. And a key feature of the Client 9 film. The other thing I would say, and this is probably going to get me in trouble, but I'll say it anyway. The other thing that I always wondered about the Client 9 story, and I don't know for sure whether this is true, but there's another shadow figure that I wasn't able to include directly in the film. But that is David Boyce, the lawyer, the famous lawyer. David Boyce is the attorney for Hank Greenberg. I always wondered, given what we know now about David Boyce reaching out and procuring ruthless private eye firms for Harvey Weinstein, whether or not that was a job that he was given on the Spitzer case. I have no way of knowing whether it's true. In retrospect, I wonder about it.
Yeah, Roger Stone is just a character. And I can't believe he's been doing it so long. His tactics, I think you are right, have suddenly become mainstream. They were dirty tricks, but now they're perhaps just the way things are done.
That's right. I think that's absolutely right. In terms of a comment about politics, Roger Stone has managed to make dirty tricks that used to take place in the shadows of the political arena. He's brought them into the Big Ten.
You're a documentarian and filmmaker. Your father was Frank Gibney, a longtime journalist, editor, and author, famous in part for books that looked at power suspiciously, like in communist Poland and the Soviet secret police. How did your father influence your work and your mission as a documentary filmmaker?
First, on my father, I think my father influenced me greatly. He was very proud of his career as a journalist. Even when he had become a businessman, he was the vice chairman of the board of editors of Encyclopedia Britannica, which, while it had its own editorial mission, was also very much of a business job. But he was very proud of his work as a journalist, both as a kind of a truth seeker and as somebody who was eternally curious. I think also in terms of his career, I'm afflicted with his same character flaw, which was that instead of the classic road to power, which is to suck up and kick down as you're climbing the ladder, he had a tendency to suck down and kick up. And so as a result, he was fired from a number of his jobs at Time, Newsweek, and Life, etc. I think perhaps I was wise enough in my career mostly to work for myself, because I think I would have had a hard time working for other people. But I think I was lucky along the way in terms of seeing some of my colleagues who, in some of their early films, were flattered very extraordinarily because some of their early films were great and much heralded. I had a much longer, tougher road to get to a position of prominence in my career. And as a result, by the time I got there, I wasn't as willing or susceptible to believe the bullshit. So I think I had that advantage. And I do think, one of the things I think about now when I make a documentary about somebody, and I make a lot of documentaries about abuses of power, and I think the Spitzer film is one of those ones that I'm particularly proud of because I think I gave everybody their say. Ken Langone, I heard him tell other people that he loved this film. He comes out with very different conclusions than I would come out of it with, but he feels I got Spitzer right and I got him right. And I feel very proud of that. Because it seems to me that you have to make films, particularly when people are willing to trust you with their testimony, that you have to be true to what it is they're trying to tell you and to embrace the contradictions of that testimony so that you feel you could watch that film while sitting next to them in a movie theater and be able to defend everything that you did. I think that's a hugely valuable exercise, that two-seat movie theater exercise where when you're watching a cut and thinking, man, I'm really taking it to this guy right now, you think to yourself, wait a minute, what if he was sitting next to me? Would I be able to look him or her in the eye and say, this is fair? That's my test.
You've covered a lot of interesting subjects in your career and a lot of interesting people. Just casually wondering here, if you had access and budget and everything you needed, of anyone living today, who would you do a film about and why?
Well, and this is an impossible task, but the person I'd want to do a film about is Barack Obama. But I fear that I would be disappointed because I wouldn't get the Barack Obama that I would want to make a film about. The Barack Obama that I would want to make a film about is one who would be ruthlessly honest. And I don't think he's prepared, willing, or able to do that at this moment in his career. But I've never seen such an extraordinary mixture of high ideals and soaring rhetoric, and yet, in my view, hugely disappointing and craven political actions that ultimately led to disastrous policies. And he is a guy who knows the difference between the principles and the actions. And so it always made me wonder why he chose the path that he chose. At a moment when he could have gone high, he went low. And yet, at our lowest moment, he was also able to go very high, particularly when it came to trying to unite us, in a moment of great rhetorical flourish. If he were to be honest, Barack Obama is the person I'd like to make a film about, but I fear he can't be honest.
Well, if you happen to make the film, I will be sure to watch it. Alex Gibney, thank you so much for joining us today on American Scandal.
Many thanks. Great pleasure. Thank you so much.
That was Alex Gibney, Oscar-winning director and documentary filmmaker. He wrote, directed, and narrated the film Client 9, The Rise and Fall of Eliot Spitzer. Next on American Scandal, debuting December 17th, we're launching a new series about the Plame affair. Valerie Plame was an undercover agent for the CIA and an expert on weapons of mass destruction. But in 2003, her cover was blown when a journalist outed her in his syndicated newspaper column. Speculation grew that it was payback after Plame's husband criticized the administration of George W. Bush, and the ensuing investigation would reveal that the leak had come from the highest levels of government. From Wondery, this is American Scandal. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Wondery.com, or wherever you're listening to this right now. If you're listening on a smartphone, tap or swipe over the cover art of this podcast. You'll find the episode notes, including some details you may have missed. You'll also find some offers from our sponsors. Please support this show by supporting them. If you like the show, one of the best ways you can show your appreciation is to give us a 5-star rating and leave a review. I always love to know your thoughts, and detailed reviews are one of the best ways for others to find the show. Tell your friends and family and show them how to subscribe. American Scandal is hosted, edited, and produced by me, Lindsay Graham, for Airship. This interview was facilitated by additional production assistance from Jacqueline Kim. Our executive producers are Stephanie Jens, Marshall Louis, and Hernan Lopez for Wondery.